She wanted one night. Now the Mafia boss can't stop thinking about her. Vivienne Delacroix froze. Grease streaked across her cheek as she stared at the man in front of her. The dim light of her auto shop barely touched the edges of the Camaro she had been working on, but she could feel every inch of his presence. Dominic Valentino stood tall and broad-shouldered, olive skin flawless, charcoal suit pressed, eyes dark and steady. The heat of New Orleans pressed around them, yet his gaze made the air feel heavier. 6 weeks ago, she had let him into her bed for one night. She had told him it meant nothing. She had told herself she could forget. Now he was here, in her ruined shop, offering to rebuild everything she had worked for, but at a cost that would trap her in his world for an entire month. Living in his mansion. Fixing his cars. Sleeping under the same roof where his enemies had tried to kill him. Vivienne's hands clenched. Could she accept the deal without losing herself? Could she survive this man's obsession and keep control of her life? What would you do if the most dangerous man in New Orleans became obsessed with you, and the only way to save your father's legacy was to move into his home? Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more dark romance stories coming tomorrow. Let's begin. Vivienne Delacroix wiped her hands on a rag streaked with oil, the humidity of Tremé clinging to her skin. She leaned against the workbench, surveying the modest chaos of her garage. Delacroix Automotive was squeezed between a crawfish shack that filled the street with the scent of spices and an abandoned shotgun house with peeling paint. The contrast was jarring, yet the location suited her. This neighborhood was authentic, messy, alive, and it had given her a home when she had no other. Her family name carried weight in the world of mechanics. 3 generations of Delacroix had turned grease, sweat, and stubborn persistence into a reputation that could not be ignored. Her grandfather had started with a single jack and a box of hand tools, fixing cars for neighbors and friends when no one else would touch them. Her father had expanded the business, teaching her every nuance of engines, transmissions, and suspension systems. She had learned to read the life of a car in the hum of a motor, the uneven rhythm of pistons, the subtle sound of a failing transmission. 2 years had passed since her father died, leaving her not only the shop but also debts that had accumulated quietly like rust inside a well-loved engine. Her mother had retreated to Atlanta, unable, or unwilling, to shoulder the weight of her husband's legacy. Vivienne had been left alone to manage the chaos, balancing incoming calls from angry creditors with the steady hum of machinery. Each day was a negotiation with the world, convincing customers she was more than competent, arguing with a landlord whose greed was as constant as the Louisiana heat, and reminding herself that she could do this without anyone else. Despite the struggles, Vivienne's reputation had spread beyond New Orleans. Clients traveled from Baton Rouge and even Mobile, swearing no other mechanic could breathe life into a vintage muscle car like she could. She could rebuild a transmission blindfolded, listen to an engine and know which cylinder was misfiring, and repair delicate carburetors without a single slip. People assumed such skill would come with vanity, but she had never had the time, or the desire, for pretension. Her work spoke for itself. Even as she mastered engines and diagnostics, she had mastered herself just as carefully. Vivienne built walls no one could breach. Relationships were a risk she had long ago decided were unnecessary. Vulnerability was a luxury reserved for those who had safety nets. She depended on herself and herself alone. It was a deliberate choice, a shield against disappointment, grief, and betrayal. Yet beneath the armor, there was a quiet ache. The shop was filled with the echoes of the family she had lost and the ambitions she had buried under daily survival. She worked tirelessly, surrounded by metal and grease, but she carried the weight of isolation alongside the pride of independence. It was a delicate balance, her competence on one side, her loneliness on the other, and she managed it like she managed the engines she touched, with care, precision, and a steady hand. Her days started before the sun and ended long after it had dipped below the horizon. She rose early to check the work schedule, greet clients, and ensure the shop ran efficiently. She reminded herself that she was capable of more than surviving. She could thrive. Every bolt tightened, every engine repaired, every satisfied customer was proof of her skill and resolve. In a world that underestimated her because of her age, gender, and skin, she had carved out a space where she was unassailable. Vivienne had learned to recognize her limitations as clearly as her strengths. She knew when a project required more than she could handle alone, and she had contacts she could rely on for difficult restorations. But she also knew when to stand her ground, when to insist that a task be done according to her standards. Her boundaries were firm, and she did not apologize for them. This awareness was as much a part of her legacy as the tools she inherited from her father. Evenings brought a brief calm before the return to solitude. On this particular Friday, the air was thick and hot, heavy with the scent of engine oil, metal, and the faint aroma of spices drifting from the neighboring crawfish shack. Vivienne wiped her brow and surveyed the last tasks for the day. She checked the waiting area, ensured the cars scheduled for pickup were ready, and stacked the invoices neatly on the counter. Every corner of the shop reflected the care she invested, even as the neighborhood outside carried its usual chaos. Her thoughts drifted to her apartment above the garage. Small, sparsely furnished, but entirely hers. It was a space where she could shed the constant vigilance required to run a business in Tremé and breathe. A place where she could be simply Vivienne, without expectation or interruption. The quiet moments there were rare and precious, and she guarded them fiercely. Turning off the last fluorescent light in the shop, Vivienne leaned against the door frame, feeling the fatigue of a week filled with engines, debts, and endless negotiation. She was about to step into the calm of her apartment when a low rumble of an engine drew her attention. Through the heat and the haze of dusk, she saw it, a sleek black Mercedes Maybach rolling into the lot. Its presence cut through the familiar rhythm of her evening like a chord struck sharply, and for a moment she felt the stirrings of something she had not felt in weeks. A mixture of tension, recognition, and the awareness that her life, carefully constructed and fiercely protected, was about to be interrupted. Vivienne straightened, wiping her hands again, instinct sharpening. She knew immediately who it was. The engine's rumble faded into the thick humidity of Tremé as Dominic Valentino stepped out of the black Mercedes Maybach. He moved with a quiet authority that made the garage feel smaller, the air heavier. Olive skin glimmered faintly under the streetlight, and his charcoal suit was sharp enough to cut through the tension in the space. Broad shoulders, confident stance, and dark eyes that seemed to study Vivienne in layers no one else could see. Two men flanked him, moving with precise synchronization to the edges of her lot, their eyes scanning the surroundings as if the city itself were an open threat. Dominic's family name carried weight far beyond the Gulf Coast. For 50 years, the Valentino organization had controlled key routes in shipping, gambling, and high-stakes ventures from New Orleans to Biloxi. Violence and loyalty were their currency. He had assumed leadership 5 years ago after his father died, guiding the family to unprecedented influence while tempering brutality with strategy. Yet tonight, he approached the garage for a reason far removed from business conquest. Vivienne watched, still in her oil-stained coveralls, arms dusted with grease, heart steady despite the presence of power and danger. She had learned long ago that intimidation was an external phenomenon. Money, muscle, reputation. None of it mattered if the person wielding it expected her to shrink. "I was told you're the best," Dominic said, voice calm, precise, with just a trace of an accent. "My associate's Camaro broke down on I-10. Transmission failure. I need it fixed tonight." Vivienne didn't flinch. "Shop's closed. Come back Monday. I open at 8. He studied her, expression unreadable for a moment that stretched longer than the Louisiana dusk. The guards shifted slightly, uncertain. Most people would have caved by now. Most would have offered a polite nod and retreated. Dominic did not. Instead, he leaned lightly on the hood of his car, dark eyes locked on hers. "I'll pay triple your rate," he said finally. "Cash up front. And I'll throw in a favor. One you might actually need someday." Vivienne considered it. The debts. The rent. The weight of her father's absence pressed against her chest. She gestured toward the car in the center of the garage. "Cash first. You stay out of my way while I work. No distractions." He inclined his head once. Agreed. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro SS was worse than she expected. Transmission badly damaged, suspension misaligned, several components seized from neglect. Vivienne rolled up her sleeves, the scent of oil mingling with the humidity, and set to work. Dominic dismissed his men to wait in the Mercedes, leaving him in the corner of the shop where he could observe without interrupting. Hours passed, punctuated by the clatter of tools and the low hum of the engine. At first, conversation was perfunctory, comments about torque, brake pads, tires. As the night deepened, the edges of their words softened. Dominic spoke of family expectation, of stepping into a role that demanded strength he hadn't chosen but had inherited. Vivienne shared the loss of her father, the weight of responsibility for her mother's absence, and the loneliness that filled the hours between customers. Around 3 in the morning, after she had tightened the final bolts and checked the alignment, their eyes met across the Camaro's hood. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, an electric acknowledgement of shared solitude and unacknowledged desire. Vivienne felt the tight walls she had built begin to tremble. Dominic, for the first time, allowed curiosity to soften his calculated composure. They moved into the back office, surrounded by faded invoices and the smell of motor oil, coffee, and metal. Words became unnecessary. Her defenses lowered, the exhaustion of the week and the intensity of the encounter pressing down, and for hours she allowed herself something forbidden, surrendering, not just to him but to the moment, to the rare feeling of being seen entirely. When the first light of dawn seeped through the garage windows, the spell of the night shattered. Vivienne stepped back, pulling herself together. "This was a one-time thing," she said firmly. "I don't do complications." Dominic's dark eyes held hers for a long moment, assessing, calculating, and perhaps understanding. Without a word, he left an envelope on the counter, thick with cash far beyond their agreed sum, and walked out, the echo of his presence lingering longer than the scent of his cologne. Vivienne exhaled, pressing her palms to her face, trying to settle the mixture of relief, desire, and unease. She had scratched an itch, confronted temptation, and survived. Now, she told herself, she could return to her carefully constructed life. She had no idea how wrong she was about the permanence of this night. Dominic Valentino had no reason to remember that night beyond its temporary distraction. Women had always been abundant around him, beautiful, willing, quick to forgive the darker edges of his life. He was accustomed to desire flowing outward from him, never inward. Yet Vivienne Delacroix had embedded herself somewhere beneath his control, stirring an irritation he couldn't name. She had rejected him, set limits, and walked away with her independence intact. And for the first time, that rejection demanded attention. He found himself driving past her shop late at night, noting the flicker of light through the windows, the rhythm of her movements. He instructed his men to observe her routines, not as a favor to her, but for him. The way she brewed coffee black, the old Motown records she played while working, the precision with which she handled every bolt and wire. Small details, insignificant to others, were now etched into his memory. Meetings became difficult. His focus drifted. Decisions he usually made without hesitation required repeated consideration. Antonio, his underboss, noticed the change. "You're distracted," Antonio said one evening, concern edged in his tone. "Our rivals won't wait for a day you feel nostalgic. Focus." Dominic didn't care. He had never wanted anything that couldn't be acquired. Now he wanted her, and she could not be taken. 6 weeks passed. Tremé, a neighborhood he respected for its history and resilience, became the focus of a rival cartel from Houston. The Moreno organization had been pushing into the Gulf Coast for months, seeking territory that was profitable and vulnerable. Small businesses were pressured for protection money. Those who resisted faced damage, intimidation, and sometimes violence. Vivienne's shop was an early target. She arrived on a Tuesday morning to find shattered windows, tools scattered and broken, and the signature black spray-painted letters across her garage door, "Pay or burn." Her heart sank as she assessed the damage. Engine lifts bent, tires slashed, cabinets overturned. Every symbol of her father's hard work had been desecrated overnight. The police took a report with polite detachment, unable to promise meaningful assistance. Insurance would cover some damage, but not nearly enough to restore what had been built from scratch. The landlord, sensing an opportunity, had been circling, hinting at selling the property to developers eager to push out long-time tenants. For Vivienne, this was more than destruction. It was the collapse of her father's legacy, the weight of grief compounded by the realization that she stood alone. Dominic arrived mid-morning, stepping out of the Mercedes with calm authority. His eyes swept over the wreckage, dark with restrained fury. "I know who did this," he said. His voice carried a measured intensity. "I can stop it. I can make sure this never happens again." Vivienne's hands tightened on the edges of the counter. "And the cost?" she asked cautiously. He considered her, his jaw tight, before outlining his terms. 1 month. 20 classic vehicles needing restoration, all on his estate. She would live on the property, work exclusively on the cars, and be under his roof. At the end of the month, her shop would be restored, her debts cleared, and she would be protected from further threats. Vivienne understood the implications. The arrangement was generous, but it came with conditions she could not ignore. She would enter his world, the Garden District mansion, the men guarding its perimeter, the subtle dangers that lingered beneath luxury and power. She would sleep in the same house as the man who had consumed her thoughts for weeks. Boundaries would be tested daily. "I'm there to work," she said firmly. "Nothing else." Dominic's lips curved into a smile that was both triumphant and restrained. "Of course. Nothing else." Within 48 hours, Vivienne found herself driving through the iron gates of the Valentino estate. The mansion rose before her like a testament to generations of influence and careful control. Guards stationed at regular intervals observed her every movement, nodding only after she had passed their lines of sight. The carriage house had been converted into her quarters, spacious, clean, and secure. Beyond it, a garage stretched wide, filled with vehicles waiting for her expertise. The first car she approached was a 1967 Shelby GT 500, its glossy finish marred by years of neglect. The scent of leather, oil, and wax hung in the air. She ran her hands over the hood, familiar excitement and apprehension mingling in her chest. It was a different challenge than her shop, luxurious, dangerous, alive with history. 20 vehicles, each with its own story, each demanding mastery. Dominic appeared as she worked, always with reasons that were reasonable, practical, almost casual. "Check the suspension," he would say. "See if the brake lines need replacing." He never touched her, never crossed the line she had set, but his presence was constant, watching, engaging, observing. He asked questions that revealed his attention to detail, sometimes mechanical, sometimes personal. Vivienne began to see the man behind the mob boss. Stories of a violent childhood, a brother lost to rivalry, a mother who had died young. She glimpsed his need for connection hidden beneath power and intimidation. Each detail, each shared word, chipped at the walls she had so carefully built. And Dominic, for his part, managed his obsession with discipline. He maintained distance, yet he lingered, appearing in her peripheral vision, asking her opinion, simply existing near her. Every moment became a lesson in restraint and longing, the tension growing as the week progressed. Then came the night the Moreno cartel tested their reach. An armed convoy attempted to breach the estate, their vehicles rattling gates and alarms. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the mansion's columns. Vivienne huddled in the carriage house, adrenaline and fear mixing in equal measure. She could hear the chaos, the shouts, the clash of forces, and the shots that ended some of Dominic's men. Dominic returned, blood spattered on his white shirt, his expression a mixture of fury and control. He found her, and in that moment, years of restraint, isolation, and desire collided. They moved together, driven by instinct, exhaustion, and an unspoken need for reassurance and connection. It was not tender, it was raw, consuming, urgent. Two people who had denied themselves finally acknowledging the force of what they could not resist. By morning, silence had returned, broken only by distant sirens and the soft hum of engines. Vivienne faced the reality of the world she had entered and the man who had captured more than just her body. The consequences of proximity were clear, and yet, she could not deny the pull he had over her, nor the way her walls had faltered despite her determination. Dominic, for his part, had risked blood and reputation to protect her. His obsession had led to action, not indulgence. He had created the opportunity for Vivienne to survive, to reclaim what was hers, while still testing the boundaries she had set. The line between protection and possession blurred, and they both felt it. Vivienne exhaled, shoulders tense but resolute. "I'm here to work," she reminded herself aloud, repeating the promise she had made. Nothing more. And yet, the understanding between them had shifted irrevocably. Vivienne Delacroix stepped through the iron gates of the Valentino estate, taking in the expanse before her. The mansion, an antebellum structure with tall columns and ivy climbing its brickwork, spoke of generations of wealth, influence, and careful maintenance. The gardens were trimmed, fountains gleamed in the late afternoon sun, and every window reflected power and watchfulness. Guards lined the driveway, hands resting near concealed weapons, eyes sharp and assessing her with every step. Her quarters were located in the carriage house, converted into a private apartment that combined elegance with practicality. The space was airy, with high ceilings and polished wooden floors, yet she felt confined by the knowledge of being watched. Beyond her temporary home, the garage awaited. Inside, 20 vehicles rested like dormant legends. A 1967 Shelby GT500, a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda, a 1963 Corvette Stingray, and more, each awaiting her expert touch. Vivienne's heart raced at the mechanical possibilities, every engine and transmission an invitation she could not resist. Dominic appeared soon after her arrival. His presence was a constant, though never intrusive. He asked her opinions on suspension alignments, oil blends, and brake calibrations. He checked progress with casual authority, sometimes bringing lunch or discussing modifications, always with plausible reasons that kept her boundaries intact. His gaze lingered more than his words, following her movements with an intensity she could feel in her bones. Their conversations gradually deepened. Between wrenches and grease-stained rags, he shared memories of his childhood. His mother's early death, the brother he lost to a rival family's ambition, the lessons of survival that had forged him into the man he was. Vivienne found herself listening, noticing the vulnerability beneath the careful mask of control. The man he revealed was human, broken, and capable of tenderness, a contrast to the calculated, commanding figure she had met weeks ago. She, too, began to reveal parts of herself. Her father's death, the weight of maintaining Delacroix Automotive alone, the isolation she had built to protect herself from disappointment. Each admission made her pulse quicken, the forced proximity allowing moments she could not afford elsewhere. Despite her determination, her walls started to crack, her boundaries tested by the closeness of someone who seemed to know her before she had allowed him to. Days became a rhythm. Mornings were spent tuning engines, evenings coordinating restorations, and Dominic was always present, observing, engaging, learning. There were no violations of her rules, no unwanted touches, only the constant gravity of his attention. Every casual question about torque ratios or engine response carried weight, a hidden reminder of his presence and interest. 2 weeks passed in this delicate tension. The air between them was thick with unspoken acknowledgement. Vivienne found herself watching him, anticipating when he might appear, noting how his expression shifted as he focused on engines or her hands. She fought the internal conflict, knowing her instincts warned against attachment, yet drawn to the intensity he carried like a shadow she could not escape. Night arrived with violence. The Moreno cartel struck in force, testing their claim on Tremé and aiming for intimidation. An armed convoy approached the estate, ramming gates and setting off alarms. Gunfire erupted in the night, echoing through the mansion's halls and the garden walls. Vivienne huddled in her carriage house, muscles tense, breath shallow. Each shot reminded her of the danger inherent in this world she had entered. Through the chaos, she heard men shouting commands, the clash of steel, and the thud of bodies striking the ground. 3 of Dominic's trusted men fell in the assault, their sacrifice marking the gravity of the attack. The Morenos retreated, engines squealing and dust rising, leaving silence punctuated by distant sirens and the smell of gunpowder hanging in the humid air. Dominic returned, blood streaked across his white shirt, yet his movements were controlled. He found her immediately, hands steadying her shoulders, eyes scanning her face for harm. There was no need for words. The shared understanding of survival, the acknowledgement of what each had faced, filled the space between them. The protective instinct he carried was fierce and unyielding. The surrender between them came quietly, without declaration or demand. Hours of proximity, danger, and shared tension culminated in a release neither had permitted before. There was no discussion, no hesitation, only recognition of the unspoken bond forming amid chaos. Vivienne felt the line she had drawn blur, the presence of someone who both threatened and secured her sense of self simultaneously. Morning light filtered through the carriage house windows, casting a soft clarity over the estate. Vivienne sat on the edge of her temporary bed, breathing heavily, hands still tingling from the night's adrenaline. She faced the truth she had been avoiding. The man before her was more than Dominic Valentino, the feared mob boss. He was a protector, a presence that challenged her independence and provoked feelings she had never allowed herself to entertain. Dominic, shirt cleaned but still bearing streaks from the night, regarded her with something more than respect, an acknowledgement of the surrender they both had accepted, the bond neither could yet articulate. He did not speak immediately, giving space for reflection, for understanding of what had occurred. Vivienne absorbed the enormity of her new reality. She had entered a world of power, danger, and influence. She had survived, adapted, and, without permission, had begun to care. The night had tested boundaries, proven capabilities, and revealed vulnerabilities. Vivienne understood the stakes, not just the lives around her, but her own sense of identity. The Garden District mansion, the vast collection of vehicles, the men at every corner, all formed a backdrop to something more profound, a connection that defied logic, one built from proximity, necessity, and a growing mutual understanding. As the sun rose fully over the estate, lighting the polished vehicles and ornate columns, Vivienne knew she faced a decision she could no longer postpone. Her instincts and principles would collide with the pull she felt toward Dominic. The consequences of attachment in his world were evident, yet she could not deny the shift that had occurred over the past weeks. She had survived violence, tested loyalty, and witnessed the depths of his commitment. Now, she needed to confront her own desires and limitations. In the quiet that followed chaos, the estate felt like both sanctuary and prison. Vivienne stepped out into the driveway, pausing to breathe in the air that smelled faintly of gasoline, leather, and summer heat. The mansion loomed behind her, guards stationed as always, engines quietly humming in the garage. She realized she had adapted quickly, learning to navigate this world with skill, confidence, and careful observation. Dominic appeared beside her without announcement. His presence, calm yet charged, mirrored the tension she carried. Their eyes met, unspoken understanding passing between them. He did not offer solutions, nor did he press for declarations. He waited. And she recognized that her choice would define not only the next hours but the trajectory of her life. Every lesson of the past 2 weeks crystallized in that moment. The value of autonomy, the importance of boundaries, the recognition that desire and danger often coexisted in ways neither could predict. Vivienne felt the weight of what she had endured, and the weight of what she might choose next. When the sun fully illuminated the Garden District, the day ahead would demand clarity. Vivienne could no longer hide behind work, distance, or rules. The mansion, the men, the cars, and Dominic himself were no longer simply elements of a transaction. They were entwined with her decisions, her heart, and her sense of self. The consequences of proximity and attachment awaited. Vivienne stood in the garage, surrounded by the rows of cars she had come to know intimately over the past month. Each engine she had tuned, each transmission she had rebuilt, bore her effort, her skill, and her patience. The work had been fulfilling in a way that felt safe, controlled, and tangible. And yet, her mind kept returning to Dominic. He entered quietly, the sound of his polished shoes against the concrete unmistakable. His shirt bore faint stains from grease and the dust of work, a reminder that even in his world, danger and effort were constants. Vivienne looked at him, at the man whose presence had infiltrated every corner of her life, and recognized the truth she had tried to deny. She cared for him, more than she wanted to admit. But love alone was not enough. She could not ignore the violence that trailed him, the world of power and danger that he ruled. To step fully into that life would mean surrendering her identity, the independence she had fought to preserve since her father's death. She could not allow herself to become someone else, someone shaped by a world that demanded fearlessness, ruthlessness, and compromise she could not accept. "Dominic," she said softly, voice steady though her chest tightened, "I can't be your woman." He froze, eyes searching hers. He had hoped, she could see it, but he also understood. "I would never let anything happen to you," he said, words heavy with promise and conviction. Vivienne shook her head. "You can't promise that. You live in a world where danger is constant. I can't wait for the night you don't come home." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken desires and impossible choices. Neither spoke for long moments, both aware that this decision was not just about hearts but survival, autonomy, and the boundaries they had both respected and tested. Finally, Dominic exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Finish the month. Finish the cars. When it's done, I'll let you go. If that's truly what you want." Vivienne nodded, the resolve in her chest firming. She would complete her work. She would honor the deal and preserve her boundaries. Love could exist without surrendering herself entirely. And though part of her ached at the thought of leaving him behind, she knew it was the only choice that allowed her to remain whole. For the next 2 weeks, she poured herself into the restoration of his collection, each vehicle a reminder of skill, determination, and control. By the end, she had honored her word, rebuilt trust, and reclaimed her independence. When she returned to Tremé, Delacroix Automotive stood stronger than ever. Debts cleared, legacy intact, and Dominic's presence lingering, even from afar. She had everything she needed. Except the man she had left behind. Delacroix Automotive had transformed beyond recognition. The exterior gleamed with fresh paint, the sign above the door bold and precise. Inside, state-of-the-art equipment lined the walls, and the waiting area welcomed clients with comfortable chairs and modern touches. Vivienne moved with quiet confidence, wiping her hands on a clean rag as she worked on a 1965 Mustang, the engine humming smoothly under her touch. A shadow fell across her workspace. Without looking up, she knew who it was. Her pulse quickened, a mix of curiosity and caution. "I'm out," the voice said simply. Vivienne finally raised her eyes. Dominic stood at the doorway, lighter in frame, the tension around him gone. The weight he had carried, the heavy expectations, the constant vigilance, the unyielding demands of his world, had softened. He looked at her with an expression that carried both relief and hope. "You handed everything over to Antonio?" she asked, studying him carefully. He nodded. "Legitimate ventures only. No risks, no threats. I tried for a year to forget you. I couldn't." Vivienne's chest tightened. She remembered the weeks she had spent in his mansion, the nights she had wrestled with her own heart while surrounded by danger. Her words had resonated with him then, more than she could have imagined. "I wouldn't live in your world," she reminded him gently. "That's exactly why I left it," he said. His eyes held gratitude, admiration, and something she hadn't expected, vulnerability. "For you. So you could have the life you wanted without compromise." Emotion prickled at the corners of her eyes. She refused to let the tears fall. Instead, she swallowed and forced a small smile. "I didn't ask you to do that." "That's exactly why I did," he replied, his voice steady and sincere. For the first time, Vivienne looked at him not as a mob boss, but as a man who had chosen something for love without coercion or expectation. The choice was now fully hers. She could decide what to feel, what to embrace, and what future she would allow. Dominic stepped closer, not invading her space, but closing the gap between them with quiet assurance. She noticed the subtle changes, the way he relaxed, how his presence no longer carried threat but possibility. He waited, patient, letting her set the pace. Vivienne allowed herself a small laugh, one that carried the tension of the past year away. She met his gaze fully, seeing the man who could have reshaped her life in ways she had resisted, now offering a future on her terms. She returned to the Mustang, hands steady, and smiled, the beginning of something new. For the first time, she felt entirely in control, not of the men around her, not of the world she lived in, but of her own heart. Dominic remained silent, a steady presence, as she finished her work. Outside, the sun cast warm light over the shop, signaling that whatever came next would be chosen together, or not at all on her terms. Vivienne stood in her rebuilt shop, surveying the space she had fought so hard to protect. Every detail reflected her care, skill, and determination. In that quiet moment, she understood what this story had truly been about. Not danger, not romance, not power, but herself. She had discovered the depth of her own boundaries and the value of self-worth, lessons stronger than any adrenaline or fleeting desire. For years, she had measured her strength by her ability to handle everything alone, but the encounter with Dominic taught her a different truth. Her independence was her power, not just a shield. She could care for someone, even love someone, without sacrificing who she was. True love was not submission. It did not demand erasure of identity or compromise of principles. She thought of Dominic, a man shaped by a world she would never inhabit. She had not tried to change him, and she never would. He had his life, and she had hers. Love did not always mean closeness. Sometimes, it meant respecting the space between two people and the lives they had built. She realized that her refusal to remain in his world was not weakness, selfishness, or fear. It was wisdom. Preserving her sense of self was her ultimate victory. Society often pressures women to give up everything for love, yet Vivienne refused that path. She had tested her limits, felt the pull of desire, and acknowledged it. Yet, she chose herself, not out of pride but clarity. Her choice affirmed that love requiring identity abandonment is not love, it is consumption. Dominic's transformation mirrored her own. By respecting her boundaries, he had learned the power of restraint, the capacity for reflection, and the value of patience. Walking away had created the space for real change. Their story was not one of instant resolution, but of growth. Each had become whole on their own before they could even consider a future together. Life was not neat, love was not always kind, and yet the story burned brightly because it began with impossibility. Vivienne knew herself, understood what she could and could not endure, and in doing so, built the foundation for genuine happiness. The lessons she had learned would guide every choice she made, professionally, personally, and emotionally. As she wiped her hands on a clean rag, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had survived danger, navigated desire, and emerged intact. Dominic had respected her limits, adapted his world, and honored her courage. Together or apart, they had earned clarity and strength. If this story moved you, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Subscribe to this channel if you want more powerful stories like this one. Tomorrow, another story you cannot miss will be released. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that knowing your worth is the ultimate power. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to you every single day.